And I wanted to start not talking about the person who I'm going to start talking about. Okay, we're going back to the year 1500. So the
Common 1500 Common Era or BCE?
1500 Common Era. There was a couple of really important things to be important to understand about. The first of all, that during many of those early times, there was no such thing as countries, right? If you think about the idea of having a large country, I mean, the wildness of Ahasuerus being a king over 127 countries or states or cities or whatever Medina was, is just administratively almost impossible to do. Because when you are, again, an empire, really just meant you were a king of a, but the concept of, you would have a certain thing with a common language, but the idea of the country of Italy, the country of Spain, you had Alsace-Lorraine, you had, Bavaria, you had cities, Cordoba, you had a lot of these cities that essentially were countries in and of themselves because there was no other way where one unit could truly control administratively such a large swath of territory. Right now, you have internet, you have phones, you have transportation. So you could be the president of the United States and have a federal government that, again, you can play it up, but that can administer many, many locales. You could have a state of California that could administer all these things. Back then, city-states were a thing. Florence was almost its own kingdom because in Florence, you could have a tax collector and you could have a king and you could have a ruler and you have what they call a pirates. You could have all these people who could control and take, but, it was a lot harder to do that under these massive, massive swaths of territory. So,
Rabbi Posy,
yes.
according to Yoram Hazoni, that's true today also.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, definitely
like
culturally.
The British Empire didn't last.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was very, very hard to administratively control all of these kinds of places. Enter religion. Because when you weren't truly united, again, you go a lot later, you go to the French, where they had this, and we'll get to, maybe an example of Napoleon a little bit later, but the French, but you had the language that united people in some way. Religion ended up serving in many ways as that type of empire, where religion kind of was able to try and achieve that and do that. And in many ways, that caused complications for the Jews and ease for the Jews, where you have, you have places and people who can give freedom and recognition to Jews. But if you had a large level of religious fanaticism, then you had places where Jews would run to one place and then be persecuted equally in the next place as well. So it's it's a really complicated time, and you have a group that starts here. You have, especially when it comes to the rise of Christianity and the parallel rise of Islam, you have massive tectonic shifts in the world that are over and above just countries. So you had, and again, where Jews were was going to be spread out in a lot of these kind of places. So you have the rise of different Christian denominations, Protestantism Catholicism, Protestantism, but you also have the very interesting back and forth of a group called the Almohads. The Almohads are a very extreme, based starting actually in Morocco, Islamic sect that I would almost call it the precursor to ISIS, in that they believed in this notion of this caliphate. They also had particularly strong views of the Jews, but they believed in taking over completely, very ruthlessly, all over the world. And they were tremendously successful. You had certain Islamic regimes, part of the Ottoman Empire in certain times, actually was a lot more understanding, accepting, tolerant. And you have these Almohads who were going to be min hakatzeh al katzeh, they say in Hebrew, absolutely diametrically opposed and very, very, very violent. Now, what was interesting is the Almohads had a very, very interesting approach to the Jews, where they thought that there was going to be some year in which there was supposed to be a Jewish ascendancy, and they had calculated whatever it was, and that didn't happen. And so therefore they said, okay, we have to therefore kill or we have to kill or convert all the Jews to Islam. Like it was like that. And Shabtai Tzvi is precursor to some of that type of rhetoric, years later. But it created this maelstrom of disorganized countries and disorganized, and so I would say organized religion and common fear that the Jews are falling into. So that's what the overall milieu is, where you had significant tectonic shifts on a religious level, very little cohesiveness on a country geographic level, and more expandedly, complication for the Jews. Because the Jews were in the middle of this, weren't Christian, weren't Muslim, stuck in all these people. Enter a man born, we think in about 1490, named David HaReuveni. Okay, so David HaReuveni was a really interesting figure. He shows up in Amsterdam one day. And wearing clothing that nobody's ever heard of or seen before. Purple robes, nobody knows what's going on. He comes with this story. And he, it's not clear so much, but he comes with a story. He says, I come from Khaybar or Kabor. What is Khaybar Kabor? It's likely a place in Saudi Arabia, actually. And he claims that he is the brother of a Jewish king. And there was a Jew, again, think about travel there. He's up in Amsterdam. Nobody knows what's going on in Saudi Arabia. He says, my brother Joseph is a Jewish king, is a wild story, with 300,000 Jewish subjects. And and again, there's different, but I've come as a emissary and the minister of war of my brother Joseph the king, who's got the plan, who is going to be able to have the upper hand to defeat the Almohads, to defeat this Muslim, this Muslim ascendancy, which, by the way, was very much feared by many of the Christian kingdoms at the time. So he comes to the Jewish community. The Jews don't know exactly what to make of this fellow, David HaReuveni. They don't know. They don't know what to make of him. Is he a charlatan? Is he crazy? Is he for real? Is he coming? He comes to the Jews and said, this is what's going to be our ticket out of the middle ground mud that we're in. All I need is a bunch of divisions of soldiers under my command and a huge cache of arms. He's like, that's all I need. I need a bunch of guns and tanks. That's what he says. David HaReuveni. So David HaReuveni pushes that the most important thing he needs to get is a audience with the important kings. Now, this is complicated because the only thing they don't like the Jews. In many places, they find sometimes where they're more tolerant. Remember, we're talking post-1492 here. He's born in around 1490. So it's a very complicated time for Jews, especially in Spain and Portugal. But they hate the Almohads even more. So he had some sort of a narrative that he could share with the non-Jewish kings, but he's not coming from a place of strength because they don't really appreciate and like the Jews. Now, I want to just make something really important to note about the Spanish Inquisition and the years of Inquisition. The Inquisition did not assume that every single person had to convert to Christianity. There was not a prohibition in Christian. They said if you're forced to convert, it's not real. So the Christian faith did not require forcing to convert. They said you're welcome to leave. The Inquisition was meant at rooting out the Marranos. The Inquisition was those who pretend to be Christian and are truly Jewish, we need to root them out. And that's what the Inquisition was all about, which meant that in theory, if you had permission to be in the country and you openly identified as a Jew, you weren't necessarily meant to be killed. So David Reuveni in Amsterdam, where it was permitted, tried to and he was a very charismatic individual, tried to get support of the established Jewish community to get him an in into some of these kings. And he has this story that my brother is King Joseph, the king of a 300,000 Israelite subject. Remember, there's not really a way to verify anything anybody said. And so he said, all I need is, again, armaments. And he tried to get audiences with the kings of, of the major powers of Portugal, of Spain, and what was really important to him, of Germany, and he wanted to get to the Pope. The Pope was going to be really the key to all of this, because the Pope wasn't really as much of Pope Clement at the time, and Pope wasn't really a military leader, but he held great sway with the kings of the individual city-states and empires and countries, especially Portugal, Spain, Germany, etc. So he comes and he goes to a bunch of wealthy Jews, gets them to fund his travels. And again, consensus is that the man was some level of a charlatan. And just to be aware, we're not going to be talking about him, but it's important to know about him. And he gets a audience with Clement VII. And he basically says, I've got this grand plan where I'm going to have my Jewish kingdom and unite it with this, the Holy Roman Empire, King Charles. I'm going to reunite with, the King of Portugal. We're going to all unite. And even though I'm Jewish and they hate Jews, but it's going to be a great alliance and we have a common enemy, this Almohade Empire. He got the audience with the Pope. And he sits down with the Pope. The Pope didn't know what to make of this fellow. And he was able to lay out this plan. And the Pope basically was like, listen, it's not really a downside. I can't get involved with whatever you're doing personally. That I can't do. But what I will do is give you a letter. So he says, great, is the letter going to say, everybody help this fellow, help David Reuveni, help this Jewish guy? And so the Pope said, no. The letter is going to say, you came to me and you told me who and what you are and make your case. So he now is armed with a letter from Pope Clement to get in, he shows up, I'm a messenger of the Jews of the East, and the Pope didn't reject him out of hand, but it's unclear if the Pope really believed him, but gives him a letter and says, go to this king, go to that king, bring my letter and let them hear you out, because I can't give you armaments. I'm not going to give you anything getting involved, but maybe the kings around Europe will. So armed with this letter, he still was viewed with a tremendous amount of suspicion. He was going to basically, from afar, made an appointment to get a audience with the King of Portugal. And again, remember, just to keep it right, 1492 the Jews are expelled from Spain. Many Jews run to Portugal, and there's a shidduch between Portugal and Spain, and the Jews within the last decade or so have been expelled from Portugal. So it's not a really great time to be a Jew. It took him a year, by the way, to even get a visa to get in to the travels he wanted to do of an audience to get into these countries. So he finally, after a year, based on this letter, gets an audience with King John or Juan or Galao or whatever you pronounce it of Portugal. So we're now about 1525. And he walks in and he has this letter from the Pope that gets him the audience, that got him the original appointment and gets him the audience. And he, again, by the way, he's a midget. He's very short, a dwarf, a very, very short man, very swarthy, wild clothing. So, almost has this messianic narrative about him. So just the sight of him, just is very eye-catching. And that that curiosity is what got him in certain regards to some of these, these people. On the way, he gets a meeting with Miguel de Silva. Miguel de Silva was one of the main Portuguese ministers. And he's able to charismatically convince de Silva that, the king should really take me seriously. So when he shows up at the king actually listens to him. And the king initially says yes, and he offers him 8 ships and 4,000 cannons. So 4,000 guns. He actually is willing to get into support of this David Arovani plan. The issue is that at the same time, one of the main priorities of the King of Portugal is to root out hidden Jews. So he's very wary of getting into some sort of alliance with a known Jew, while he's spending a major part of his time persecuting the hidden Jews, the conversos, Marranos, whatever you call them, within his kingdom. So on one hand, being a Jew is the most terrible thing and will catch you doing it, will kill you if you're pretending to be Christian. But yet this very charismatic Jewish fellow wants me to go in a alliance with him. And he ended up, at least initially, although he rescinded it, agreeing to join forces with this David Arovani. Okay, now here's where our story, can you believe it? Here's where our story actually begins. David Arovani shows up for his meeting with King of Portugal. And he is admitted to the main drawing room by the assistant named Diego. Diego is probably about 18, 19 years old. He is the maitre d', the main executive assistant to the King of Portugal. And this wild-looking messianic guy, shows up. And Diego is the first person he meets. Diego invites him in and says, okay, you'll sit in this room. Let me hear your petition, and then I will present you to the King of Portugal. And so he, tells Diego his whole plan. I'm the brother of the King of the Israelites, and my brother has 300,000 subjects, and he wants to have this thing, and we're going to take back, and it's going to be part of this big Jewish vision in a concert with the Christians, and that's what I'm going to present to the king, and I have this letter from the Pope, da-da-da-da-da. Little did this fellow David Arovani know that Diego was actually a Marrano. Now, Diego wasn't a Marrano himself. He was a second-generation Marrano. Diego's parents had converted to Christianity, but practiced what Judaism they knew in secret. But they were very, very publicly Christian. And obviously Diego could have no level of a Jewish education. And he was a bright boy and a go-getter, so to speak. And he rose to by his late teens, early 20s, to be the associate of the chief of staff, whatever, of the King of Portugal. He always knew this secret in the back of his head, knew that revealing this secret would be his death, and acted completely, was very reliable and a great staffer. The King of Portugal liked him very, very much. And Diego was his right-hand man. But when Diego sees David Haruveni, sees this, very short, swarthy, oriental-looking man who is coming with this wild story, Diego is hooked in hook, line, and sinker. Diego is totally bought in. And he says, I had a dream last night that somehow I should be changing my tune and embracing my Jewish roots. And you showed up the next day. David Haruveni, you're the man. I totally buy into everything you're saying and everything you're doing. And I'm going to go and drop everything and join the Jewish, and embrace my Jewish heritage. Now, David Haruveni hears this and is furious, because David Haruveni says, I don't care about you, Diego, but if you announce yourself as a Jew and start following me, my whole mission is going to be a failure. I want to raise, join the king and raise the specter of whatever, and to join, have this alliance and get all these cannons and get all of these soldiers and all the chips. And if I'm seen as the guy who unmasked, so to speak, the king's right-hand man as a Jew, that is the end of me. And so he says, Diego, you better keep your mouth shut. Don't you have anything to do with me. I have no interest whatsoever in having, literally anything to do with you whatsoever. Diego is kind of crestfallen, but he says, okay, I'll listen to you. He's totally a chassid, again, hook, line, and sinker, head over heels following this fellow David Haruveni. He thinks he's Mashiach. He thinks he's everything. He thinks, and again, it had to do with this dream he had. But he says, I'll accept your request. And then there are a couple of meetings between the king that, Diego sits quietly like David Haruveni asked him to do. And there's these meetings between the King of Portugal where David Haruveni, lays out his plan. During the days of these meetings, David Haruveni back at the hotel, and he gets a knock at his hotel room one day, and he opens the door, and it's Diego. And Diego says, I had another dream last night, and I realize why you're rejecting me. I realize why. It's because I don't have a bris milah. That's what he said. It's because I don't have a circumcision. And I know that if you're really the Messiah, you're really this great Jewish leader, you would accept me for my Jewish heritage, but you refuse to do it. And that's the reason why you're pushing me off, is because I don't have a bris milah. Diego said, that's what I did. I gave myself a bris milah last night. That's what he said. He said, now David Haruveni hears this, sees this fellow Diego, who happens to be actually in a lot of pain. And Diego says, oh my goodness. I'm sorry. And David Haruveni says, get out of here. First of all, I will have nothing to do with you. But more importantly, so he did not gain David Haruveni's favor by getting this bris milah, but he says, you are now in tremendous danger. You better run for your life right now. And frankly, you've ruined my mission already, but I still don't want anybody to think I have anything to do with you. But he said, you must run for your life this instant and never look back. And so Diego takes his advice, and Diego said, you know what, actually, you probably are right. And sort of has this moment of clarity. And he says, I still believe in you, David Aruveni. I still think you're the man, so to speak. But you're probably right that I should turn tail and run right now, because I don't think I'm going to be particularly successful, at keeping my job after I just circumcised myself to prove myself Jewish. So indeed, without looking back, Diego turns and runs away. He travels a little bit and finds himself connected to someone by the name of Mahari Tetzak, Rabbi Yosef Tetzak. And most of the time where he met him was in Salonika. He traveled a little bit and he ended up in Greece, and he meets Mahari Tetzak in Salonika. And then something wild happens. They write about this in some of the in testimonies of the day. They say niftichu ma'ayanot hachokma, that he comes into this Rabbi Mahari Tetzak, this great sage, one of the great gedolim at the time, and he becomes like this wellspring of knowledge. They say that he, in the next 4 or 5 years, became a incredible, not only from nothing, but he was a very clearly very, very bright, genius individual. And he became so immersed in study that he went from like 0 to 100, and he was just imbibing so much great knowledge and understanding in Torah, and he just would be have incredible hatmadah study, and within a short number of years he ended up becoming a world-renowned sage himself. He changed his name. He was no longer Diego. He changed his name to Shlomo Molcho, Molcho, Shlomo Molcho, or Solomon Molcho. Similar, like Shlomo HaMelech. But he was basically an itinerant traveling preacher sage after he had this training under the Mahari Tetzak. So much so, and this is what's wild, where he was considered one of the sages that the great later generations of sages were inspired by. Have you ever heard of Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz? Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz, one of his most famous things, he was a great mystic, and Mocho was very much a mystical worker as well. But Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz was famous for being a Kabbalist, a great rabbi who composed many tshuvos, but also composed Lecha Dodi. That's one of his most famous composition. Shlomo Alkabetz was inspired by Molcho, who had just such a wild story that he was considered such a sage that even these great sages learned from him. You know who else was inspired in many ways by Molcho? Rabbi Yosef Karo. Rabbi Yosef Karo, actually saw Molcho as a source of psak. Like if Molcho said something, that's something you should maybe follow. There's a very famous a line in the laws of tzitzit, where in the laws of tzitzit, there's a question about the number of knots and the number of this and how long you have and how much distance between the knots. So very intricate rules of the laws of tzitzit. And it's very clear that they write, well, we saw Molchos Tzitzit, and he did it this way, and that's why the halacha should follow. He was seen as a source of halachic psak. Just think about it. He was the grandson of the children of Maranos, zero Jewish education until he was, early 20s, ran for his life, and within a decade, he was now one of the sages that was a leading sage for many of the Jewish people. He never forgot David Raveni. By the way, David Raveni did not come to such a great end. David Raveni never really succeeded in getting an army or anything like that. But he ended up traveling and just going from place to place to to try and still rouse this Jewish army that he apparently kept on talking about and believing in. Now Shlomo Molcho, who ended up having a very strong and great Jewish literary. David Raveni had no Jewish bona fides, so to speak, in terms of his scholarship. But David Raveni wrote Sfarim on Tanakh. He wrote Sfarim on the Shas. He was a published author of works of scholarship of the level of Rishonim he was born by the age of 30.
Rabbi, you said that Shlomo Rubeni wrote this. You mean?
No, Shlomo Molcho. I'm sorry, Shlomo Molcho.
Okay.
Yeah, Shlomo Molcho. He's the real topic we're talking. He wrote very much messianic type of stuff, that was. But he has written. So that was a lot of that stuff. Some of the stuff was not well known, was discovered later. But he wrote books on the halacha, right? Books on the Gemara, and his most famous book was a book of his sermons on the Parsha. But as he's getting into his his later 20s, he and some, a couple of decades have passed. There's now a new king in Portugal, etc. He decides he wants to follow his mentor and not just be a Rebbe, not just be a rabbi, of which he had, very quickly risen to significant heights of doing so. And written, the Rabbi Posy talks about this great learner, and everyone should be like Shlomo, who we call Molcho, who was really revered among much of the elite of the rabbinic caste. But he decides, I got to go back on the road to, go back on the road to go back and follow the path of David HaRuveni, and go and try to recruit armies, etc., and get audiences with kings, etc., etc. He goes to Rome, and he lives he goes to the lowest part, living under a bridge for a month in Rome, because there was a tradition that somebody, the Jewish king, the Mashiach, will somehow be with the Shfelei Romi, the lowest of so he lives with the beggars and the lepers in in Rome. And that, he said, prepares him to have an audience with the same cast of leaders that his mentor, David Raveni, did. And he decides he also wants to build a Jewish army and join forces with all of the powers of the world that exist at that time to build this Jewish army. Now, he had a very interesting tool in his arsenal, which was his dreams. And again, this is documented in historical works about what, who knows what his dreams were, but he had a dream that there was going to be a flood that's going to be incredibly deadly, and That's going to happen in Rome. And there's going to be an earthquake in Lisbon the next year. And that's going to be incredibly deadly in Portugal. And he sent letters to the kings of Portugal. By the way, there's a new king in Portugal who he's less persona non grata with, in the past. But he ended up, was persona non grata in the other way. He ended up sending these letters, and they both came true. There was a deadly flood in Rome on October 8th, 1530, and a deadly earthquake in Lisbon the next January in 1531. So these leaders were now suddenly taken with him. He got an audience with the Pope, and the Pope was like, oh, this guy's serious. And there were some cardinals in Rome who followed him, and he was, so he's able to get some of these audiences by laying out the plan, so to speak, with the Jews. And these, when he got in front of the Pope and the king of, some of these kings, it didn't actually go very well. They still approached him with a very significant level of skepticism. We're not such a big fan. He went actually to Germany, and there were the German Empire, or the Holy Roman Empire, so the Austrian, one of the really most powerful leaders at the time was Charles V, who led Austria, Spain, Netherlands. He was a very, very powerful leader. And he got an audience with Charles V. Guess who decided to meet up with him and join him? Way back when, the one who was rejected him before, David Rouhani. So the two of them came together. The two of them, David Rouhani and Shlomo Malcho, now reunited. With Rouhani still being a crazy, wild-looking, swarthy, person of Oriental descent, or claimed to be of Oriental descent, and Malcho, who was a lot more, although he was also a little bit wild and crazy looking, but a lot more articulate and had this sort of more bona fide appearance of recognition. There's one testimony that he carried a flag that said Maccabi, Mi Kamocha B'Elam Hashem, somehow was very sort of regal looking, etc. And he had this meeting for 2 hours together with it seems to be together with the Rouhani, with the court of Charles V. And he says, listen, we'll join with you. We'll have this joint Jewish-Christian army. We'll succeed in repelling the Muslim threat that you're worried about, and we'll recapture the Holy Land, which is obviously something that was always in the mind, post-Crusades, a few hundred years, with a lot of the leaders at the time. They totally miscalculated. Charles V sits down with them and decides, after listening to them, that not only was he going to have to help them, but they needed to be arrested. Now, this wasn't, by the way, the first time. One of his trips through Israel, actually, he was, Shlomo Malcho was arrested and was sentenced to be burned at the stake. And the story goes that they burned somebody at the stake, but it wasn't him. At the last minute, he escaped and continued on his travels. But this time he was arrested and sent actually to Italy, which was under the control of Charles V as well. In Italy, they gave him over to the local branch of the Inquisition. And as he's brought to the stake, this time it was really him, they offered him, and people were very afraid of him because they thought they had all these powerful mystical powers because he had this prophetic ability to, to predict these major events. And so they actually put a gag on him. They couldn't speak, so they didn't know that he would say some wild incantations. They were very, very afraid of him. And at the last minute, they say, you're welcome to be taken off of the stake and get a full pardon if you return to the Catholic Church, which is where he was raised for the first 20 years of his life. He refused, and he was burned at the stake, while David Aruveni said, sure, no problem, and was exiled to Spain, where he later died. But David Aruveni avoided being executed, but Mocho was executed. And he said, I've given up so much for this religion, I'm not going to drop it now. And he was executed and burnt at the stake in 1532. So he's like 32 years old, and had all these crazy, wild and crazy adventures, was used in a very wild, again, a wild and crazy back and forth. We have a variety of his writings that are used by scholars. What I think the most interesting is the way that he was seen and was able to be mainstreamed, especially after this meteoric rise from really nothing in terms of his Jewish knowledge to be seen as a mainstream person, and the impact he ended up having on generations of especially mystical thinkers, beyond his day. He always believed in David Aruveni. He thought David Aruveni was the man, although in a certain regard, he acted as if he thought he himself was Mashiach. But that's the story of Shlomo Mocho, where, like I said, there are still laws and halachot that end up relying on some of the things that he had said. So what I wanted to just raise is the issue of individuals who have, on one hand, seemingly good knowledge and understanding and scholarship, on the other hand, a lot of really wild and crazy stuff about them. And a big issue, and he had a tremendous opposition from many Jewish sources. There were many Jewish, great rabbis and sages that very much disagreed with him and rejected him, out of hand. He traveled a lot. In some places he would get to, he'd have to run with his tail between his legs away from him, because he rubbed the Jews the wrong way. And many of the Jewish leaders said, all you're going to do is cause us more trouble. We've had enough trouble since the Inquisition in the last 10, 20 years. We don't need you stirring things up again and making, discussions with the kings and this and that. Others felt that he, rather than the Mashiach, but he was like a savior. He was coming to totally turn the tables and start a new era where the Jewish people would have longer and more strength in the world and the governments in which they lived. But it led to a fascinating debate that has existed for a long time, especially in the era of what I call the messianic, the false messiahs, leading to people like Shabtai Tzvi, Nathan of Rome, others, that do you reject someone out of hand because of the fraught nature of what they represent and what they are? Or do you say, listen, you can buy into his megalomaniacal or his big aspirations on the political end, but he had really interesting laws about Hilchot Tzitzit. He had great things to offer, and we should accept him for that. And that seems to be uniquely the way that it was that he was accepted. He was able to prove his bona fides as a Talmud Chacham so much that people accepted, within that part of him, even though he was not necessarily, accepted in a more larger and favorable way on his political end. So I want to just end with that. We're going to have to actually end a tiny bit early today, but I want to just share a fascinating story of this person, Shlomo Mocho, But the real question of, on one hand, you have a very strong sense of reject people who have all of these really problematic aspects to them, like Shlomo Molcho had in terms of his, seeing messianic aspects. He didn't necessarily make it better for the Jews in all his political operations. David Raveni absolutely did not. His devotion to someone who is at least a unclear person, a person of dubious intent, and most likely a charlatan in David Ruveni. Again, David Ruveni, I think everybody agrees that he may have been from somewhere, but he didn't represent some 300,000, kingdom. Who knows what would have happened if he would have been able to convince even more people to build this army with him. But especially when it comes to Molcho, the impact that he had on a scholarship level, and could you divorce that from the impact? There's the famous story of Elisha ben Abuya, Acher, where this was exactly a dispute in the times of the sages of the Mishnah, where on one hand, this was Elisha ben Abuya, a person who learned and became a great sage, then at some point for a variety of reasons, rejected his faith, and his student, Rabbi Meir, decided to still learn from him. And he says, you know why? Because I'll throw away the chaff of the bad stuff he says, and I'll keep the great sage, wisdom that I still learn from him, because he's a really smart guy who knows a lot of stuff, who has a lot to teach. So this was the debate surrounding Molcho, and it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts about how should we approach, someone who has the different sides of their character. Yes, Suzanne, you just got to unmute.
Mhm.
I think very spiritual people are different than the rest. And I think there is some reason why later people said you should only learn Kabbalah after a certain age, okay? Is there in psychology a strange saying that very Kabbalistic people maybe have a tendency to some kind of messianic, and I don't know. Is there a psychiatric abnormality in people who deal so much in mysticism?
There have been there's a whole field of doing some of this I would call forensic psychology of historical figures, trying to analyze all of this kind of stuff.
Reuveni were two extremes of different kind.
Yeah.
They had some psychiatric abnormality.
I think that's fairly clear. Yeah.
And then we have the danger in that, because Shabtai Tzvi had such a deleterious effect.
Yeah.
So much
Terrible.
learning for 100 years later.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, it was really, really complicated and problematic, and it was an issue that a lot of Jewish communities really struggle with. Yeah.
Another question.
Yeah, Susan.
Was Elisha?
Oh, two Susans. There's two Susans.
Another question, just a short one. Was Elisha ben Abuya also into mysticism or not?
Not necessarily, no.
He rejected it totally unrational.
Right, because what David Ruveni did was never purported to be particularly religious.
No, he was just making.
And Molcho essentially gave his life for his religion. So Elisha ben Abuya rejected the religion in a more active way, which was a little bit more controversial.
From his rational point of learning, that's what he did, I think.
Yeah.
Not from, and he always revered the religion of his friends, right?
Yeah.
He would not cause them to transgress or anything.
Right. Miriam, sorry, Sue Benuitz. Yes, Sue, go ahead.
How did he choose the name Molcho, or how did he?
Yeah, it sounds like Shlomo Molcho, like Shlomo HaMelech.
Oh, it wasn't like be Molcho me.
No, Molcho, like it sounded like, and sometimes I called him Shlomo de Mitkarya Malcha, like he was King Solomon. Like talk about Messianic,
It didn't have anything about forgiveness.
No, I don't think so. That's actually a really good question. Yeah, I think it was more about king as much as forgiveness. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Anyway, I find it a fascinating chapter of Jewish history, a fascinating story, which is, I think, an issue that raised a lot of questions that people think of. That notion of wholesale rejectionism of someone with problematic or questionable characteristics, or accepting the wisdom from which, this person clearly did. And this is a unique, perhaps even an anomaly, an unusual way where it looks like the mainstream actually did take bits and pieces and not take bits and pieces.
Did they ever figure out where Ruveni came from?
Where Ruveni came from? There's still, there's
Is there genealogy to tell us?
There's a lot of different questions. He claimed to have been this Kubar, that's where he said he was from. Others suggested he was from India, actually. Goa, which had just been captured actually by Portugal. There are those who thought that he was from there. Okay, well, anyway, I wish everyone all the best. It is great to see everyone. And we should, Mir Hashem, have a chance to continue to learn and study and have wonderful experiences together.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.